Hi everyone. Today is Thursday, Jan 25th. We missed a couple of meetings this month, so good to see you all. I think the borderline for saying Happy New Year is 15th, but I'm going to break that rule. Happy New Year to everyone. And Joe, thanks for joining us. Let's kick this off today. Um, I just want to ask: is anybody here who's new who wants to introduce themselves? Please, share a little bit, and then we can get started. I see most of the people that we know here, but Sriram, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Hey everyone, my name is Sriram. I'm mostly active in SIG release and SIG contrabacks. And I think I've joined the architecture meeting like once, sometime last year. And yeah, I'm just here to learn
Okay,
more of it.
thanks. Welcome, Nilek.
Oh, sure. Hi. My name is Nilik. I usually active in SIG and related areas, but recently picked up some other work that we'll mostly talk about right now. So been meeting or discussing this with SIG API machinery folks, and now here to sort of expand some of those thoughts in this group.
Sounds good. Thank you. Mo, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Would you mind opening up that linked doc?
Yeah. How about I give you? Let me make you co-host.
Oh, okay. Let's see how this is gonna go. I'm like not at my regular desk, so we'll see how this goes.
Okay. Yeah, we can try. Otherwise, we can come back.
No, I think you're typing loud.
Sorry. I'll mute myself.
Okay. Mo, you are co-host.
Thank you. Let me try to figure out how to share screen. Where's the share screen button? I always get confused between Teams and Zoom because they put it in different places. Okay, let's see if we can do this. All right, so now you guys should see the agenda from my machine. And then I can open the doc up. All right, can everybody see that? Do I need to zoom in? I can make it bigger.
Yep.
All right. So the topic that we wanted to chat with you all about is so today all of our APIs have the concept of a resource version, which is pretty integral to how watches work, and their consistency and all those aspects. But sort of since the beginning of the project, the field has always been a opaque string with the idea that it was a detail of how the system worked and the system itself was responsible for the meaning of it, but clients just needed to honor the semantics and we would take care of the rest. One of the things that we want to do in SIG API machinery is, for the longest time, we've had this out of tree controller called storage version migrator that helps you migrate the schema of built-in resources or CRDs and other things by issuing series of no-op writes. This pattern is also exactly what is used by encryption at rest to do key rotation, which is basically issuing no-op writes to data, and then if it changes, that means something caused that change. We could continue that pattern. So we wanted to move the outer tree controller in tree because it didn't necessarily get the adoption we wanted. It is also a controller that needs incredibly broad access to the Kubernetes API, and it really does feel like something that should be built in. But the problem with the current approach on how that controller works is it has to make a lot of chunked lists to get the list of objects, and it has to then make the series of update calls with them. if your cluster is under memory pressure, or in general, if you have a large number of resources that you want to migrate, doing those list calls can your API server and possibly the controller manager as well. So with that in mind, we wanted to try to come up with an approach that allowed us to have the storage version migrator entry enabled by default at some future time, and perhaps commonly used by the community and entry components to have storage migration running, right? Like the ideal state would be that at some future point, we can rely on schemas being reliably migrated for entry objects, and CRD authors can rely on some capability that allows this to happen. And encryption at rest can rely on rotation being something that's very easy to automate, and so forth and so on. So if we want to have this capability, it really does need to be built in a way that it doesn't introduce like catastrophic risk to your control plane by basically it, by asking it to do far more than it can. So with that in mind, David had the idea of what if we changed the approach that we were going to take, and instead of making these live list calls to get the object information and doing these updates, what if instead we looked at the cache that we maintain in Cube Controller Manager for the garbage collector, which, if you all remember, uses the partial object metadata cache. So those watches are much more efficient because they only have object meta information. And then using that cache, we would be able to get the list of names for a particular resource at a particular resource version, which we could then use for storage migration. And therein lies the crux. In order to use it in that way, we have to make very specific assumptions about what the actual schema of resource version is. In particular, we have to be able to check against the live API server what resource version it's currently at and the resource version of the garbage collector cache. And we want to make sure that the garbage collector cache is basically new enough, and therefore it's safe for us to start storage migration. And so we wanted to bring that up to this set of folks, because it would be very strange for an entry component to take this dependency on what is technically not part of the API right now. Yeah, so I guess we wanted to get your feedback. David, Joe, Nilek, anything I missed? Any comments you guys would like to add?
I thought that was a really good summary. We did talk about this recently in SIG API machinery, and we recommended Mo bring it here. This topic has come up many times in API machinery because it's a visible part of the API. There's nothing preventing people from doing this before. We think a lot of people are already doing it. I think we may have already had one other entry case where we were doing it. At this point, I think like Hiram's law is in effect, and if we tried to change this, we would break people pretty bad. And right though, I don't think there's any plan to change it in the system. I'm pretty comfortable with the idea that this is now part of the API and we can't change it, and we should accept that it is useful for people to do this.
So, couple of questions. One is, given this is storage migration, this presumably doesn't do anything with aggregated API resources. Because I, for one, do have an example, although it's not, I mean, we can, I do have an example where I use a non-integer resource version for an aggregated API, aggregated resource, an aggregated API server. So I assume that's irrelevant here. Is that an accurate assumption?
Who wants to go first?
Does your resource need to have a storage version migration run on it? I guess
No.
maybe slightly differently.
No,
does
I
it
wouldn't
have,
want to.
does it support a both a create, update, list, and a list? because I think that's where we start drawing that line, because we have others where you can't manipulate them. Things like a subject access review, you can't. Not all the verbs work.
So there's two. The reason I'm humming and hawing is there's two things. Is yes, it has all those things, but really it's kind of a bad API that I want to change eventually, or I'm encouraging the people now maintaining that project to move away from it. So it's not necessarily a blocker. My concern isn't so much my particular little thing, but it's, do we think there are other controllers and other, in particular, aggregated API servers out there that might be relying on the fact that, it's an arbitrary string. And if that's the case, would the only limitation we're introducing be that they don't get storage migration and they have to figure that out themselves, which I think honestly would be fine. But I'm just trying to understand the implications to things we don't know about.
David and Joe, maybe a quick question so I can try to remember. So in the initial version of all of this, we are not proposing any form of automatic migration occurring. So John, in your specific use case, nobody would create the intent for a migration to happen.
Right.
Thus, nothing would break. That's just the first step, though. We do want to get to the state where things can be automatically migrated and the system does it for you. And as David mentioned, if you support the verbs, that's probably one of the ways we would try to drive that. And the question I had for David and Joe was, in the storage version API, where we would probably build some of these triggers from, I'm trying to remember, would an aggregated API server be responsible for its own storage version API, or does that come from the Cube API server?
We would expect that the aggregated API would manage it itself, but I think in thinking about this, like what's a more useful way to phrase my thoughts? The very likely next step to this would be creating the sort of caching library that the scheduler wanted, right? So the first time we explored this, it was at the request of SIG scheduling, and they were interested in having a write-through cache. And there were difficulties there. None of them were insurmountable except for being able to do a client side greater than, like refresher than. The other ones were surmountable. So if I'm not aware of any other aggregated APIs taking that approach, the vast majority I know of that people would wire a list watch up to are all backed by etcd, by normal storage. We could try to we could create some sort of a marker someone could place saying, I am indeed I am indeed normal. I am indeed comparable. That's something that we could explore if we had to accommodate strings.
Well, or we could make the requirement not that you must be an int, but that you just must be a comparable string. Or I guess then you'd need to know how to convert the int, or you get the wrong order.
Yeah, so like if everyone else is an int, John, you
just no.
Yeah.
Like I said, this isn't something I would. I'm less concerned about the specific instance for me because I don't. There's ways to work around it. It's not an issue, and this wouldn't even come into play, frankly.
Yeah. I think
but the concern is more the unknowns, the unknown unknowns out there. But again, it would probably have the same thing. They're not going to be migrating the storage in that case, right? So they're going to be responsible for it themselves.
But it is worth pointing out, like, as soon as this becomes policy, I expect that we will see people trying to make things like a write-through cache.
Yeah. So, you're right. Yeah.
Yes, this is the first bit, but I don't want to pretend that this is the stopping point.
But those features then, yeah, okay.
Okay. Can I ask some basic questions? So the first basic question is, where does this code live right now? And who's taking care of it, I guess?
Which code are you referring to, James?
The out of tree controller.
It lives in Kubernetes SIGs. It is ignored by us, I guess.
It's an API machinery.
It's under API machinery, right? Like double quote. Okay. And like you want to bring that code into KK and you want to run that code as a controller, as an op. Like we build it separate binary and it runs as a controller, just like the other controllers that are there. Correct? But then one thing that you mentioned more was like we would like to make sure that all clusters will have this running, right? I don't know how to make that happen, right? So we can't mandate unless we make it part of conformance, correct?
Right. So my intent there was to say that having it enabled by default would be a reasonable thing for us to do, that people would not be concerned that we had created some inherent risk in their environment. I
Right.
don't think we would prevent people from disabling the controller, just as you can disable the other controllers.
Right.
The other little bit of nuance is the out of tree controller. It uses paginated lists, and it doesn't make any assumptions about resource version other than the ones that are already guaranteed.
Okay. I'm not even going there. Like I'm just looking at it from like the point of view of like somebody who's looking at a cluster, right? And how does somebody tell this controller to actually do something, right?
You mean the out of tree one?
Yeah, it doesn't like when it comes to in-tree, we start the controller, but then
So
do we
yeah, when it
tell
comes
the
to
controller
entry,
sorry, go ahead.
you will have to create a storage version migration object. However you want to do that is up to you. And that is your intent, saying that the resource that is inside of spec, you want it rotated. You want it migrated, sorry.
And that one is a built-in object and not CRD, right?
Yes, it will become a built-in object. It exists out of tree as a CRD today.
Okay, so if it is a built-in object, then we can inspect for conformance reasons, but we can't mandate still a controller that is running that actually processes those for sure.
Right.
Okay, I think I've exhausted those set of questions. Anybody else had any basic questions before we dive into deeper?
I guess I don't know. Is this a basic question? Like, what was the motivation for the decision 10 years ago, almost probably, to make it an opaque string, other than to enable? I'm assuming it was like, well, we don't want to rely on etcd behavior that we like, and we don't need it, right? It's creating additional expectations on the client side, which we've created implicitly by actually, de facto keeping them integers for the most part. But like, I think this gets to Derek's question, like if people used a different backend, it's kind of bleeding an implementation detail of etcd out into the client side, and is that going to have an impact on projects that try to use something other than etcd? Do we have any visibility into any of that?
We know that they would then need to have a comparable int that was always increasing.
Just to be clear, between the API server and etcd, even if you were to switch your storage, the API server does make assumptions about how the revision, etcd calls this revision, we call it resource version. It's the same number, just bleeding through. But at that layer, it does, like all our code makes very strong assumptions that is a number, and it can compare it internally. So between the API server and etcd, that's already a hard requirement. The question really here is what we do at the higher level.
Yeah, so
Okay,
I
and
think
just-
to Derek's question about things like kind, the RPC already enforces that it's like an int64. Like there just isn't a way around it.
okay, so it's just between API server and clients. And I mean, honestly, then, well, yeah. The question would be whether there's any clients relying on it, potentially, the only would be a weird thing like what I did with the aggregated API, and that is workaroundable, like I said. So if this went through and we needed to work around it, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. And so, yeah.
So is there any good or bad pros or cons for CRDs here with this, or CRDs are like part of the things that will take care of already?
So there won't be anything automatic. So in the beginning, assuming this stuff was all GA'd and enabled and present in most environments, an individual that was maintaining a CRD for some external project and was evolving the schema over time could include in their released manifests SVM objects to cause storage migration to occur at some regular cadence. And this would allow them to migrate away from old schemas.
Okay.
That's sort of the starting phase. Ideally, what would happen over time is like when you do make those schema changes in your CRD, we being the API server would notice that you had done that and automate the fact that you do actually need a schema migration. That's not sort of on the table today, but it is sort of like the nice logical next step.
So looking at it from a couple of personas, right? One is the cluster admin, and then the other one is the cluster operator. Is there anything there to worry about? Like, I guess it's up to the cluster operator to make sure that this thing is running and it's on, and then I don't know who will make a decision. Like the end user customer with an admin privilege will go around. Hey, I need to migrate this. Like, when will they make a decision like that? Like, what will prompt them to make a decision like that?
So the two common cases are like things like encryption at rest with KMS. So let's take the easy example of you encrypt all secrets at rest using an external KMS plugin. Whenever you rotate the key for the external KMS plugin, that's when you should make an SVM object that asks the API server or asks controller manager to do the rotation for all secrets. So that's one sort of triggering factor. Then the other place would be, theoretically for entry resources when we evolve their schema over time. Today, we take the policy of even if we delete the REST API for like a V1 beta 1 or whatever, we never delete the V1 beta 1 schema because we have no idea what people have in etcd.
Right.
So if we wanted to get away from that, we could start having some mechanism for creating these objects at particular cadences so that stored migration would happen. That still leaves the question of would we delete the beta structs at some point, and that would require us to make assumptions about people who actually had the controller running. So I'm not sure what we would do there. I don't know if Joe or David, you guys have any thoughts around like the future state of how we maybe make some progress in those places.
I think that for the purposes of the question being asked here, we can decide that later. The question here is about the mechanism of how we would bring this in, right? So we want to bring it in a way that won't cause memory spikes in the QAPI server for any resource that we're looking at. And that's why we're trying to avoid doing additional lists because they are prone to doing that. And we, in particular, for this, we cannot use a list via streaming feature that is coming in due to size concerns with the number of lists. Without us being able to say, we know that when we get cash to this point, we're good. So this really is just about the resource version here. In terms of removing those, I would very much like to remove old serializations, but that also has impacts on clients, and so it can't be done quickly.
Yeah, okay. Then the next question is, like, how will people know that whatever they requested is done? The storage migrator has moved all the things, like they rotated all the KMS keys from version to a newer one.
Oh, go ahead, Mo.
So the SVM object itself does have a status, which you can then sort of use to see the current state. Presumably for things we do in tree, we would try to build semantics around that, I asked for a migration, the migration started, and then the migration did actually complete before I take some decision. Joe?
Yeah, I was going to say a very similar thing. It's you can track progress on this and know that you don't have to go back because if something makes an update to a resource, it's now at a new resource version. So if you go through things, you know everything you've progressed past, you never have to look at again. So if you keep track of your progress and you eventually reach the end of the list, so to speak, then you know you're done.
I have a question. So does rollback come in that path? Let's say SVM is created during an upgrade goes through, and then something needs to be rolled back and it rolls back. So would that status change, or the user has to create, be understanding of that something was rolled back, new objects could be created, so I have to create a new SVM object?
I think I might need some clarification on what you mean by rollback. If you
cluster
mean
rollback. Cluster rollback, I mean. So cluster.
like a downgrade?
Yeah. Well, not a downgrade. So when we do updates in many places, we go through a blue-green cycle, right? So during a blue-green cycle, things start, take maybe an hour or two, whatever time they have, and then yes, turn back if they doesn't go through, right? So at that time, is there any implication on that front? Maybe not. So just wanted to clarify.
So generally what we would say there, like I can use CAMSV2 as an example. We, in between the beta version of CAMSV2 and the final GA, we made changes to how data at rest was going to be stored exactly. And in order to make sure that those changes could be done in a way to support something like the blue-green, where something failed and you wanted to roll back, we basically assumed you had some activity on your cluster similar to what SVM would do, which is like making changes, updating items, making new items. So with that in mind, we basically kept the cadence of those changes set in a way that you would never progress further than the maximum that could be supported while allowing you to downgrade one release. So the way this would work is, say if you ended up needing to downgrade like multiple releases, before you downgrade, you just need to run another storage version migration for any resource that you felt the need for that. And then you could basically keep going backwards. I mean, there's probably other implications in the sense that that's probably not well tested and upstream, but that's sort of how I would reason about it.
Yeah, I was meaning only about one version during upgrade time. So you say that if something has SVM figured that I'm done and put the status as I'm done, and then a rollback happens for any reason, the customer or the user has to go and create another object now that system has changed.
If they want that. I don't know why
they won't necessarily need to roll back their storage version just because they roll back their components.
I think.
Yeah, there's already a requirement that if you roll back your version, that we have to be able to understand what's in storage written by the future version. So that's already built into our support for rollback.
Thank you.
Okay. Then the other question is like, is there a decision already made on like there is not going to be like an offline tool for this, and it is going to be something that is a controller and it's running constantly?
I think we're all agreed on that a controller is the most practical way to do it, and that having a please migrate this with a response is the most practical way for us to manage it. The automation of that can be different. And is it pronounced Geode? I hope it is. If your question had, as long as etcd is moving forward, then this is a decent assumption. When you start looking at an etcd restore, questions about happens before, what did a resource version mean, become slightly more complicated. But that exists regardless of what we choose to do here.
Okay, thank you. I'll yield the floor to other people. I think I've been hogging a bunch of these the time so far. Anybody else wants to?
Yeah, I guess, James, I just put a bunch of like past discussions I was aware of around resource version semantics in the chat for us, hopefully to, I don't know, refill our own local caches and compare our old prior resource versions to see what past discussions were. The only thing I was just trying to tease out is like, has anything changed about the problem space now versus 2022 when these discussions were happening that like is bringing in an urgency or a need to resolve it? And then if we do resolve this, like what are the other things that are still not working as expected? Like the one I saw here with events not actually working appropriately come to mind. But for stuff like Kine, I saw Mo like, I don't know if that project works or won't work with the change. I think what I was just trying to think through is to be good, like broader CNCF community citizens, like who can we invite to the discussion that we can reasonably ask to comment on their impact, like even if they weren't necessarily in the
I'll take care of that.
Ring of planets discussing the topic.
Yeah, I'll take care of that. I'll ping the rancher folks who use Kine a lot, K3S.
I think one of the biggest things that has changed, Eric, is that we have a need now to resolve a storage version migrator problem. When it was contained inside of its own pod, having it was bad. Having it crash an API server was also bad. But at least when it was it would itself. And bringing it into the Cube Controller Manager increases that area, but we have a solution. And the solution is this comparison.
Yeah, I think my recollection though is like the scheduling components had similar arguments on the benefit of allowing it to be comparable, but I was just trying to find like an index of like related beneficiaries or impacted parties by the change, just to make sure that we had a total view. I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing per se, just helping us to figure out who to engage. But I thought the scheduler components had similar desires.
Similar desires, but they were not blocked in the same way. So for them, it was a performance improvement versus a stability risk.
So maybe what I would ask is that Derek found a few good issues with some discussions in there. And one of the things, just glancing through them during the meeting, like Clayton was saying, hey, maybe we should add a conformance test. Maybe we have a way to add, I believe, conformance tests in a provisional state now. Stephen, maybe you can confirm that. And if we do that, then we can actually see if everybody out there, all the distributions are passing that test, that validating this thing obviously doesn't do anything for like ecosystem projects, but at least it tells us that the distributions themselves won't have problems with it. That might be a useful signal, right, to see how safe this is. But what I would suggest maybe more broadly is if those folks who are interested in making this change would go through the existing issues that Derek raised and maybe look for additional ones and kind of provide their counter arguments for why the reasons that stopped this from happening in the past are no longer critical. I think that would be helpful rather than us just sort of relitigating out of nowhere without the previous knowledge that people have already applied.
Well, I mean, asked in the other direction, like, do you guys actually have anything? So previously there was a cockroach experiment. It was ongoing. It ended up dying. That was the practical reason.
Right.
Is there something similar that we can just go and like shortcut and say, talk to that person? Because when Steve K looked at it, for instance, he was able to look and say, oh, well, I can actually produce that integer.
Yeah, I'm not objecting to the motivations or reasons or histories. I'm just aware of resource version has been a contentious topic.
I haven't said no. I'm just asking if you can shortcut to like the people we need to talk to.
Yeah, at this point, I'm not aware of anybody else that is not using HCD right at the front. Like everybody is going through the HCD facade, right? So that protects us at this point. But we can put a call out to see who else pops up.
I'm honestly not that worried about people replacing HCD. I just want to make sure that we've considered all the implications. And I, for one, at least wasn't involved in those other conversations. So I'm not going to just say, I mean, I can go back and research them and that's fine. But I would rather the folks asking to make a change sort of at least do a little prep work there for me, for those of us. It's not just me, right? I assume there's other people that would want to do the same thing.
Yeah, the only other thing, the timeline on the storage version issue, like there's a lot of benefit, obviously, David, in what you're describing. I guess I thought, John, your recommendation on just like getting some type of soft test signal to see who would be or not impacted, like I'm assuming as a project posture, if you pass conformance in the past, you shouldn't fail conformance in the future, without like a real significant time to get into alignment, if at best. So yeah, I was just wondering, it seems like that recommendation seems pretty practical to like give the signal to. I don't know the timing need on this, and then the storage.
If it's urgent, that might be different. Yeah.
I'm more concerned about being sure we find the right people as quickly as we can. So if it was something like last time where there was a particular project in mind, it would be really helpful to know who it is. If there's not, then yeah.
Yeah, and I think we should, I mean, draft the cap and like when we do the PR, that is a time when we can like ask people to go tom-tomming it about and getting feedback. I don't want to go with just the Word document that we have now.
So the way I'm reading the room is nobody is fundamentally opposed to this in this room, but let's do we got to do the process and we got to do a little bit more background, or a little bit more clearing with the rest of the community.
Yeah. Yeah. Also from the code organization point of view, like, you know, adding a new controller and like doing the builds and like doing a new image, all those things are pretty straightforward. Yeah, the only other thing is like, do you want a staging repository? But we can work through those things. Okay, Jordan, you've been very quiet. Do you have anything to say?
No, I've been distracted, but the things that other people were talking about. We had talked about this before. It's worth trying to make sure we're getting feedback from everybody we can find who has an interest in this. I don't have any objections to moving in this direction and giving an opportunity to get feedback if anyone sees problems with it.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so we have 15 minutes. Mo, is this enough time for you to introduce the second topic?
Yeah, I can try. I don't think CJ is on the call, but I'll do my best to just sort of introduce it, and maybe we could keep chatting in a
Yeah.
different meeting.
Yeah.
And I don't think Tim Hawken is on the call either. But
He said he would only be here for the first half, if at all. So
yeah, okay. So the gist of my question is, so in this particular conversation, I have my SRC hat on. And as an SRC member, I happen to know of certain things that are bad, that are unfixable because they are part of something that's V1GA. And I have the sense that I don't think they're used super often, but they are used, some people. So we can't just rip it out. So with all those things in mind, what I wanted to ask was, is it a correct and reasonable approach to try to introduce deprecated feature gates for those types of things that start off being enabled by default, eventually become disabled by default, with the idea that over time, risky features or behaviors are no longer present by default? A cluster admin style persona can opt back in should they need it in their environment. And since there would be some transition between being enabled by default and being disabled by default, you could imagine someone saying, all right, I'm going to spin up a new cluster for testing purposes, and I'm going to disable all deprecated features. And I'll use that as a mechanism to try to see, am I relying on them anywhere? But yeah, that's what I wanted to bring up. So KMSV1 is a vague, like KMSV1 is not like a security issue. So it was, but it is a place where we use a deprecated feature gate to disable it by default and require an opt-in to use that functionality. But you're not at like risk of some compromise to your environment. But I wanted to see, do folks feel like such a pattern is acceptable for things that we do think might be harmful? And David, that's your hand.
Didn't we have to do this for the networking issue for services or endpoints a while back? I feel like I remember a PR from Tim Hawken that was either creating an admission plugin or a feature gate that did this.
So I don't actually remember where we landed on that one. The reason CJ had brought this conversation up with me is him and Tim Hawken had a conversation internally where Tim Hawken had said that, and I think to some degree Tim is correct on this, that feature gates are meant to be transient and temporary, and features graduate to stable and the feature gate disappears, or features get deprecated and removed. So this is like a weird place where we're saying that like we can't take the thing out because it's part of like something that's like quote unquote done and people do use it, and in certain environments using it is probably totally fine. But that doesn't seem like a good reason to say that every person
Yeah.
has to worry about the risk.
Yeah. So the one thing that quickly comes to my mind is like API server has anonymous auth flag, right? Like it's not a feature gate, it's a flag. So maybe that is still one of the things that we could be doing, right? Like introduce a flag where the default is something, and we change it over a period of time to on or off, depending on like which way we want to go. As long as it does, like I guess then the question is like, does it affect conformance or not, right? Like that is where we have this issue of like, okay, if somebody has turned something off and it for a security reason and it affects conformance, then uh, you know what what do we do then, right? Like are they still conformant or not, right? Like that is where my head is going.
So I'll make a couple comments. I think that what you're sort of describing is probably the right approach, and that it's not so much a feature flag of a deprecation feature flag as it is an introduction to a flag to control the action, to control whether that's on or not, and that introduction of that flag is the feature. So it's and then the introduction of that flag and maybe its shift from introduction of a flag that defaults to turning off the thing. It's kind of awkward, but that's fits into our model. I don't know. But
Yeah, so the piece I liked about feature gates is because they're sort of in one place. We can define a
Yes.
concept of a deprecated feature gate. You
yes,
can have an easy mechanism for saying even the feature gates that are enabled by default, I want you to disable them by default in my environment, and I will take the onus on testing and validating that I'm okay with that. Like if you just keep adding new flags over time, yes, you do move the ecosystem forward by eventually disabling by default, but you don't make it easy or obvious to know which flags are the like. I mean, I guess we could name them. I don't know, bad deprecated thing, and like we have some reserved prefix.
Yeah.
I guess some discussion is needed around like secure by default kind of situation, right? As a group, it can't be like a one-off thing that we do every now and then. What is our take on secure by default, right? Like, and then use that as a way to drive the discussion and say, okay, here is the set of things that we're going to do to make ourselves secure by default. I think
That's an interesting topic. Yeah. I think that, kind of just adding multiple flags in a feature gate for the flag seems like a lot of complication for the theoretical idea that a feature flag should be temporary, ephemeral. So I think that's worth discussing whether that's worth it or whether there's a different thing here that's a different type of feature gate, like you said, around deprecation. The other point I wanted to make was with regard to conformance that Dim's brought up. Like, I mean, we can change, right, what's conformant and what's not, and also conformance is about being able to create a cluster that passes these tests. Not that every cluster created by this distribution passes the test. So as long as they can configure it in such a way to pass conformance, it doesn't matter what the defaults are. So, Jordan.
Yeah. Most of the time, the problematic behaviors that we find are not ones that we would put in conformance tests anyway. So I'm not especially worried about conformance tests. It's like, oh, you could use this to do a bad thing. And then we will come up with some optional way to opt into preventing the bad thing. I don't think we would ever codify, you must be able to consistently do the bad thing everywhere into a conformance test. So I'm not super worried about the conformance aspect. There's whether it's a feature gate or a flag, there's sort of two things in play there. What is the default? And do you want the admin to make a decision about this thing? And we've been talking about sort of what is the default behavior, but feature gates don't actually really make that. Like feature gates let you change the default, but they don't prompt admins to make a decision about a thing. And so you could imagine, like, you used to be able to do a bad thing. We decided it's pretty safe to default that off. If you just change a feature gate, an admin will upgrade, maybe not know about this edge case, and we've changed the default behavior without the admin knowing. Another pattern is to have an option that is a required, like it doesn't have a default. If you don't indicate which you want, when you start up, it says you have to indicate which of these behaviors you want. That's another pattern that we've done over the years. That at least makes sure that the admin knows that this thing exists and is making a decision. So that's one sort of point in favor of a flag. I mean, we have flag fatigue. It sort of stinks to just introduce new flags and say, you have to make a decision about a thing you probably don't care about. But the alternative is we just silently change behavior out from under you, and maybe you did care and you don't realize, which is also pretty bad, whether we did it with a flag or a gate.
It reminds me of what Golang does to us, right? In some ways. Anyway, I think we need a proposal of some kind more so we can talk about this a little bit more. The closest that I can think of is SIG node. I think there was a change in how the liveness probes works, and then I think at the request of someone, we had to add a feature flag, so that they can use the old behavior, and then over a period of time, we deprecated the flag and took it out. I think it started as deprecated, probably. So that's the closest that I can think of. Sergey?
Yeah, I wanted to mention that flag, and I actually wanted to raise this hand for a different thing, but for this flag, our mistake was to make a GA from get-go, assuming that in single release we will have everybody transition to the new prop timeout, and they will all be happy, and we will remove this flag right away. But turns out that transition is very complicated. People don't know whether they're affected by this bug, and we don't have any good documentation. Nobody wants to work on this documentation. So this flag is still GA, and it's still present, and we don't want to remove it. So I think it was a big mistake to mark as GA from the very beginning. We should have given at least a couple stages for this flag. Maybe beta would be better. So that may be one feedback. And I think if we will try to get into feature gate being a marker for deprecated features, we may not pay as much attention on like what is actual user behavior, like how they will transition. As Jordan said, that administrator now needs to make all the decisions, and it's not like binary in many cases. Like sometimes you just need to do like slow transition of pods, like one by one, or like maybe you need to have some rollout mechanism. And if we default using feature gate, it will complicate life for all the people who want to transition slowly and test it slowly. So I think whatever mechanism we will come up with, we always need to ask if we can do better than just a one feature gate for everything. One example I can give is right now we're discussing what the right approach to change read-only behavior for volumes in SIG node. So right now there is a like read-only volume that you can set, but then you can unread-only like subfolder because it's not recursive read-only. And on certain Linuxes, we can now do recursive read-only. And now we're discussing, do we make it part of pod spec, and then it will be forever indicating that you can do like strange read-only that is not read-only, or you do it, and then it's stuck forever because it's part of a pod spec. Or you do it like just fix a bug, assume like you just pretend it's a bug and fix it very broadly for everybody. And then you end up with people being affected with that. So we're still debating like what's the right approach. And I really cautious not to make it a global thing, yes or no, for everybody.
Yeah. Okay, we have 3 minutes left. Any other hot topics or something that anybody wants to talk about?
I just wanted to mention, so the gist I got from this conversation on the second topic is to maybe work with the other SRC members and try to come up with a bit more of a specific proposal and see what folks think.
Yeah, I think if you say the topic is secure by default and like what are the things that we can do, I think that is a good way of like, you can work with SIG security as well, right? And get their thoughts as well. Okay, thanks a lot, everyone. See you in 2 weeks. Bye.